This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. It's a turbulent time for higher education, with uncertainty swirling about what college will look like this fall. Among the big questions, how is the coronavirus pandemic reshaping the admissions process, from who gets in to who gets financial aid and more? Joining us to talk about all of this, as well as the latest developments in the Varsity Blues admission scandal, is Melissa Korn of the Wall Street Journal. Melissa, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me.
So there have been some developments in the Varsity Blues scandal, which, of course, was a federal operation which found that parents were paying a consultant for access, but also to fudge and even forge admissions documents to get their kids into high-powered schools. What's the latest?
So the case is now more than 14 months old, but still pretty active. In just the past week or so, we've had two very high-profile parents plead guilty, Massimo Giannulli and Lori Loughlin, the actress. And that was a bit of a surprise to see them plead. They had been expected to take the case to trial this fall. So they pleaded guilty. They'll be sentenced later this summer. And we had a few new parents also get charged and agree to plead guilty, two more parents just in the past week, which shows that investigators are still pursuing the overall scheme. They are still investigating and prosecuting. They're not just kind of sitting back now that they've had a number of guilty pleas. So one of the interesting things is one of the parents who just pleaded, he wasn't connected to Rick Singer, the consultant mastermind. He admitted to paying off a coach at Georgetown independently of the whole rest of the scheme, which indicates just how broad, how widespread, how deep some of this corruption might have gone.
Do you think those surprise guilty pleas were related at all to the coronavirus pandemic and the fact that they've been letting out some high-profile, big-name, white-collar, if you will, prisoners who are doing so, at the fear of the risk of the spread of the virus in correctional institutions?
There's definitely been speculation about that for the timing. I don't know for sure. A lot of the parents who did receive prison sentences have asked to have them reduced to serve out the rest of their time in home confinement or to delay their entry into prison because of the coronavirus. So I don't know for sure if that's a reason for these particular parents. However, they had filed requests to have the case dismissed, and the judge declined those requests pretty recently. So that might have spurred this kind of decision to just bite the bullet, plead guilty, and move forward.
There was some indication that this scandal might reduce the advantages of the rich in college admissions, but then the pandemic hit and campuses shut down. When you look at college admissions across the country, do you think things are becoming more or less equitable?
Sadly, I think less equitable. There's glimmers of hope in some areas. You see things like a movement for colleges to pay more attention to rural high schools, or to inner city high schools, or to schools where they haven't recruited students before, period, no matter who the students are. And those are wonderful, and I feel some sense of optimism. But at the same time, you still have so many colleges just going to the schools that they know they'll get good talent because they've gotten it there before, or they're close with the college counselor, so they know that they know who they're getting. And I think that perpetuates whatever the current student body is. They're not expanding their horizons in any meaningful way. And I think the coronavirus, first of all, there's so much inequity in what the educational experience is right now for high school students. So, some are still getting wonderful college counseling remotely. Others haven't spoken to their college counselor at all since this began, if they're even able to log on, if they have good Wi-Fi or internet access or access to a hotspot. So those very fundamental inequities in just how high school is happening right now, I think really will continue to highlight the challenges in college admissions. You've got students who are able to finagle virtual internships still, or do some sort of coding camp or online programs to keep boosting their resumes during this time. You've got others whose parents have lost jobs and are figuring out where their next meal is going to come from and how to take care of themselves if, family members in the hospital sick. So it's a really challenging time. And I think we saw a little bit of this for the current class, the students who will be starting school in the fall or, in August. And I think we'll continue to see a lot of it for the current students who are wrapping up their junior year of high school in terms of some of those inequities and how it'll play out when they can even think about, can I go to college next year?
You've written a book about the scandal. It comes out in July. Congratulations on that. I'm curious, what's your take on it in the book about the potential long-term impact of this scandal on college admissions more broadly?
Yes. So the final chapter of the book is called "A System Reformed?" question mark. I tend to be a pretty cynical person, and I think that comes through a bit in the book toward the end there, where I say, I think the scandal highlighted a lot of problems with the system. I don't know if we're seeing all of those loopholes closed or really an acknowledgement of responsibility by a few different major parties. You've got the high schools that help perpetuate this race toward a handful of select institutions. You've got the colleges that don't really verify much of the material in their applications. You've got parents who are so focused on status with the few marquee school names. And you've got some of the students as well, to take ownership. And a lot of them just haven't. When I was at NACAC, the annual conference last fall, the thing that struck me so much was this refrain of, it wasn't an admissions scandal. And as I say in the book, like if the organization that oversees college admissions won't take this as their own issue, as their own problem, that's a sign that this isn't going to get fixed anytime soon.
Your book has been optioned for a TV project. What's that like?
Yeah, so the book was optioned last spring by Annapurna production company. And it's exciting. It's a little weird to know that what we've written for the book will somehow be turned into a miniseries. Production is obviously halted right now, just as production on everything is. But we're still optimistic and excited to see where it goes from here. There's a writer for the show. So we're not writing the TV show because I'm a journalist. I don't write TV. But it'll be exciting. The whole process for the book and the TV show was quite unexpected and not the way that we've experienced it. I say we, I wrote the book with another Wall Street Journal colleague, Jennifer Levitz. It's not the way it normally happens. We were approached by a literary agent the day the Varsity Blues scandal broke. And we actually were approached by a few and then chose one to work with whom some colleagues had raved about and went forward from there. And it was such a whirlwind and quite exciting and terrifying. But it's definitely kind of not the normal process of getting a book deal and then getting a TV option or any sort of option for it.
For reporters who want to cover this very important and very popular topic right now of college admissions, I'm curious what suggestions you have for them in terms of sources, online forums, organizations that you found to be helpful.
So I mentioned NACAC a little while ago. I think it's a wonderful organization, the National Association for College Admission Counseling, and their members include high school guidance counselors, college admissions officers, and independent counselors, so private college consultants. And there's thousands of them, and it's a tremendous organization, and they have, tremendous as in very large, and they have regional groups as well. So if you're covering education, higher ed, admissions, in the Rocky Mountains or in the Pacific Northwest, there's kind of local groups for each of those. And I think talking to high school folks, talking to college counselors, guidance counselors, principals at high schools is really valuable because they are able to see what the students are going through in real time. So it's one thing to talk to college admissions officers about what the universities are doing or how they're doing outreach or what trends they're seeing. But talking to the people who are really on the ground with students regularly as they're going through this incredibly stressful time is certainly valuable for me.
And they're two sides of the same coin, aren't they? Because you're looking at the gatekeepers, and then you're also looking at the folks, for better or worse, who are trying to charge those gates.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is. It's always interesting to see those groups together because they are all part of the same process, but at different points in the process.
Do you have any tips or suggestions for building trust with those folks to get them to pull back those curtains? Are there questions you've asked that you've found help to sort of build that relationship, more quickly, especially if you're on deadline?
There's a few people who will always pick up the phone, and that's great, but you don't always want to go to the same handful of sources. So I think trying to build those relationships longer term, if higher ed is your beat or education is your beat, and you're able to build up those sources so that when you are on deadline, they will pick up for you. That's always great and better than just pulling a name out of a hat and calling them randomly, calling coldly. I think asking them what keeps them up at night. What are they troubled by in the process, in the system right now? That's always a question I ask, really, no matter what the topic or no matter what type of source it is. It's a college president or an admissions person, because they didn't get into that line of work for the money. They got in because it's something they're passionate about. And if they're troubled by something, it's probably worth a story. So for some, it's about equity and access. For some, it's knowing that they're not giving as thorough a read to an application as they wish they had time to do. For some, it's knowing that students don't think they can afford a private college, even when the financial aid is more generous at a private than a public. But really asking them, what's on your mind? What's upsetting you right now? And what's troubling you in this space? They usually will open up pretty fast for something like that.
We're talking with higher education reporter Melissa Korn of the Wall Street Journal about her coverage of the Varsity Blues scandal and college admissions more broadly. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And many thanks to everyone who's taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us grow. Melissa, I'm wondering, what's changed in your reporting in light of the pandemic? I'm thinking not just about some of the story topics, but how you approach your day-to-day work.
So my day-to-day work is now all contained in my apartment in New York City. We stopped going into the office in mid-March, like many others did. I happened to have been on book leave not long before this all began, so I have a proper desk set up, which I found extremely helpful with a desk and a second monitor and a decent mouse and all that. But, a lot of my reporting has always been by phone. So that has continued. I think I've gotten to know sources better in a very different way because we commiserate over doing this with kids in the background or someone's dog barks or, there's a siren outside or something. You kind of get to know each other on a slightly different level now, even if it's not a video call. I'm not doing more video calls just because they're possible. I don't see a need to do that. But I think just acknowledging that this is all a little weird for everybody helps break the ice with any interview. I also think journalism is never a 9-to-5 job. And right now that is certainly true, in part because of the pace of coverage, the need for coverage, but also when your home is your office, is your restaurant, is your bar, is your everything, it kind of just all bleeds together. So I find myself working more on weekends and at nights. And these are topics I care about so deeply. So it's not a complaint, but it's definitely even more all consuming than perhaps it was before.
We've definitely talked in some recent episodes about the need for self-care, and that journalists often don't want to ask for help on that front, especially when you're reporting on folks who are in much more dire straits. It can feel almost silly or unnecessary, but really it is true, isn't it? You've got to set those limits.
You do. And I have a fairly young child, so it's a juggle for sure. And I find myself just exhausted a lot. Naps help. Naps are good. And I get my work done when I'm on deadline. I meet my deadline. And if I'm working on a feature, I get it done, whether it's at 2:00 in the afternoon or at midnight. So as long as I'm getting it done, I can take the time I need to do some of that self-care. But yes, it is quite a luxury to be able to do any self-care right now.
You've written an interesting story about a shift in the power dynamic among students and some of the elite schools, which typically would have filled all of their freshman class spots by May 1st, pulling in kids from the waitlist. But now they're actually heading into June with some open seats, which means that some kids can be more choosy. But I'm curious, is this also potentially a boon for state universities or flagship schools that might suddenly be more attractive to local students who want to stay closer to home?
I've heard from folks at some public universities that they're seeing banner years right now. Despite everything going on, the deposits that they're getting from students are at record highs, and they'll have their biggest freshman class ever, they're expecting. Because of that, either the students don't want to go away, the parents are a little nervous about sending their kid on a plane somewhere. Or there's financial concerns, and just an in-state institution just seems like a safer bet economically right now. So it's a definite potential upside for state schools, especially for the flagships. But I think, as you mentioned, the power dynamic has shifted a bit, particularly for students who don't have financial need. I don't think we're seeing it benefit everybody across the board. And here we get back to this issue of equity or lack thereof. Students who aren't asking for scholarship money from a school really are in a very strong position right now. Schools, so many have announced budget cuts, furloughs, salary freezes, all of that. And a full tuition paying student is, I once had someone describe it as a leprechaun on a unicorn. They're quite rare. So if you are in that boat, you are a hot commodity right now for these colleges.
And that's probably especially true at schools where they're having a massive downturn in international students who were paying full freight.
Yeah, I mean, when you have a school with 15 or 20% of their undergraduate students coming from overseas, and you're not sure that they can show up in the fall, or if they want to, if the US in general is still such a hotspot for the coronavirus, they're terrified. They don't know what their freshman class is going to look like. They don't know what their returning student population is going to look like. And they're not really sure how to hit their tuition revenue targets right now.
You've also written that state universities are particularly vulnerable right now and may have an even more pressing need, at least in the short term, to fill some of those seats. Explain that.
Right. So public universities do get some of their funding from their states. It really varies widely by state, and that's always a good topic to dig into no matter where you are in the country. How public is your public university, essentially? Do they get 5% of their budget from the state? Do they get 50%? And no matter what that share is, though, losing that money from the state is really problematic because it's something that they bank on. So earlier this spring, we saw a number of states start to plan out their budgets for next fiscal year, but also recalibrate their current year budgets and say, you know what, with the coronavirus just decimating the tourist industry, or sales tax has gone down, things like that, the state budgets really had to be rethought, and a lot of states started to cut money from higher education as well as from a bunch of other sectors. It was effective immediately. So you saw schools in Nevada and New Jersey, for example, all of a sudden have to contend with cuts of tens or hundreds of millions of dollars effective that day, effective the next day. And they had to finish out this fiscal year, which generally ends at the end of June, with a lot less money than they had banked on.
Do we have a sense yet about how this pandemic is impacting potential first generation college students and students who need that financial aid?
It's not good. I think this is an issue to watch closely. Students for whom college wasn't a sure bet anyway, or who didn't always, since they were little kids, expect to head to school. This has thrown just such a wrench in the lives of so many people in so many different ways that college just seems a little bit more of a far off dream right now for some, which is devastating. There's a lot of discussion about, do you take a gap year? Well, a gap year is kind of a luxury, right? If you're well off, a gap year is when you go and you travel around or work a few different jobs and find yourself. A very oversimplified description of it, perhaps. But if you're not well off, a gap year is you're delaying college for a year because you can't afford to go. And I think we're seeing a lot more students really wrap their heads around that. We've seen data on FAFSA completion, and high school seniors and also returning students. The number who are filling out applications to get federal financial aid are down quite a bit. And that's a really distressing data point to look into and to see, because that kind of telegraphs what students or what prospective students are thinking about whether college is even on the horizon for them right now.
Another story that caught my attention was you had an interview with Mark Schlissel, president of the University of Michigan, talking about the fact that they may cancel their football season if it's not safe for all students to be on campus in the fall. He has sort of a unique vantage point here, given that he's an immunologist by training. What was that conversation like?
Yeah, so first of all, that was about a 20 or 25-minute interview. So we were really excited to be able to dig into such meaty topics very quickly in that call. You don't always get that opportunity. So, it's a good reminder that you don't need 3 hours of discussion time to get a really good story from somebody. So University of Michigan obviously is a fantastic and well-regarded university. It has a very famous football program, and he has taken a slightly different approach than some other university leaders in just saying, we're not quite sure what the fall looks like yet, and we're still figuring that out, and we know what all the questions are. We know what we have to figure out in terms of how to do this safely. We're just not sure that we figured out how to do it yet. They have, I think it's 7 different committees kind of navigating what will large intro classes look like, what will extracurriculars look like, all of that. And they'll make a call in the next few weeks. But it is a sharp contrast to some other schools that have already said, we're going to bring back our football teams on June 1st to start voluntary practice. And we're going to have a team and we'll have our frat parties and it'll be college like normal-ish. And then there's usually a little asterisk at the end of that messaging saying, if local health officials allow. So there's this kind of enthusiasm and decisiveness that is then undermined a bit by the reality that these are plans and these are intentions for a lot of the institutions right now, but they just don't know what they're going to be able to do 2 months from now or 4 months from now. So you've seen some schools say, we're going to bring students back to campus early and we'll end the term early. You have others say, I think the University of Virginia just said in the last day or two that they'll plan to have students back, they think, but you can also take your classes remotely if you're more comfortable with that, or if the faculty have underlying health conditions, they'll offer their classes remotely, kind of a very, very hybrid model. You're seeing some creativity for sure, but I think there's just so many question marks still for all these schools.
What advice do you have for higher ed reporters who want to get ahead of some of these admission trend stories this summer?
One of the things to keep an eye out for is what's called summer melt. So just because somebody put down a deposit to attend an institution doesn't mean they'll show up in the fall. And I think this year more than ever, schools are really nervous about that. They just can't predict who's going to walk away from a deposit for whatever reason. We're hearing a lot more about students and families doing double deposits, and then they'll make a final call when they know what the school is going to do in terms of on-campus versus online fall semester. So talking to the local universities and colleges about what they're seeing, both in terms of deposits and in people walking away from deposits, how they can possibly wrap their heads around and plan for housing and dining and course offerings when they don't know who's coming or how big their class will be. And again, going back to what I said earlier, talking to guidance counselors and high school officials about what they're hearing from their students, what trends they're seeing from their students about putting down more than one deposit or kind of waffling over their decisions. So I think this is a summer of great uncertainty for admissions and for enrollment.
Melissa Korn is the higher education reporter for the Wall Street Journal. She's also co-author, along with Jennifer Levitz, of the forthcoming book, Unacceptable: Privilege, Deceit, in the Making of the College Admissions Scandal, which comes out in July. Melissa, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week. Take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.